The heavy wooden doors of the village church creaked open to reveal a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The morning light filtered through the stained glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air, but it fell upon a sanctuary that was unnervingly empty. The altar linens remained perfectly pressed, the candles stood unlit, and the familiar scent of incense still clung faintly to the stone walls. But the man who had stood there just days before, guiding his flock with an unwavering voice, was gone. He had not simply left. He had vanished, leaving behind a community paralyzed by profound grief and suffocating fear. The faithful who gathered in the pews that morning did not sing. They barely dared to speak. They simply stared at the empty space before the tabernacle, grappling with the violent rupture of their spiritual lives. To lose a priest in the natural course of time is a sorrow every parish eventually faces. But to have a spiritual father abruptly torn away, erased without explanation, leaves a deep and lingering psychological wound. For the villagers, this disappearance was not just the loss of a leader. It was an assault on their sanctuary, an intrusion of profound darkness into the place they sought light. The men and women who knelt in the nave carried a heavy, silent guilt. They asked themselves the agonizing questions that echo through history whenever the innocent are taken. Could they have done something? The helplessness they felt was a bitter cup, a daily reminder of their vulnerability in the face of an unseen, oppressive power operating beyond the reach of justice. Those who had attended his final mass replayed every moment in their minds, searching for clues, for some hidden warning in his gentle demeanor. The psychological toll of such a sudden disappearance leaves a community suspended in a permanent state of waiting, unable to fully mourn, yet unable to fully hope. In the weeks that followed, the empty altar became a symbol of a much larger human struggle. It represented the conflict between quiet faith and systemic brutality. The villagers experienced a profound isolation that seeped into their homes. They had been robbed of the hands that baptized their children, the voice that absolved their sins, and the presence that stood by their deathbeds. Yet, amidst this devastating emotional landscape, something remarkable began to take root. The act of returning to the empty church became an act of quiet defiance. They did not need to see him standing at the altar to know that the truths he had spoken there remained absolute. The physical absence of the priest slowly transformed into a powerful anchor for a community that refused to be broken. Human nature naturally recoils from the unknown, and the mystery of his fate was a torment that tested their endurance. Families whispered in the dark, wondering if he was suffering, or if he was still alive in whatever cold cell had become his new parish. This uncertainty is an agonizing form of grief, a psychological torture designed to break the human spirit by denying it the finality of a proper farewell. It is a mourning without closure, a weeping without a physical grave to visit or decorate with flowers. The trauma of his sudden removal forced the parishioners to confront the stark reality of the cross. They began to understand, in a painful way, the words he had preached about the cost of discipleship. The empty altar was no longer just abandoned wood. It was a living testament to the cost of standing firm in a world that demands capitulation. Ultimately, the human impact of his vanishing extended far beyond the immediate shock. It forged a resilient faith among those left behind. The sorrow they carried was incredibly heavy, but it was not entirely devoid of meaning. Every silent prayer offered in that seemingly abandoned church was a declaration that truth cannot be abducted. The authorities had taken the man, hoping to erase his influence, but they inadvertently cemented his legacy in the souls of his people. The profound sadness of his disappearance became the soil in which a deeper faith was forced to grow. They learned that divine grace persists, even when the physical sanctuary is completely stripped bare and the loyal shepherd is violently taken into the cold night. the silence of the empty sanctuary gradually transformed from a source of paralyzing terror into a profound spiritual revelation. Initially, the absent priest represented a triumphant blow dealt by an oppressive regime against a vulnerable community. The captors believed that by removing the shepherd, the flock would inevitably scatter, their faith crumbling without its visible leader. Yet, what unfolded in the quiet darkness of that village church revealed a deeper, more enduring reality about the nature of human conviction and divine grace. The physical structure had been violently hollowed out, completely stripped of its sacramental heartbeat. But this very deprivation naturally magnified the spiritual clarity of those left behind. The villagers slowly realized that their missing priest was not simply a victim of political cruelty. He had become a living embodiment of the Passion of Christ. His sudden removal from the altar was, in a tragic and beautiful way, the ultimate continuation of the Mass he could no longer publicly celebrate. To understand the true magnitude of this absence, one must look through the lens of the Catholic understanding of the priesthood. A priest does not merely perform administrative duties. He acts in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. When the secret police dragged him away in the dead of night, they mistakenly assumed they were silencing a troublesome political voice. They did not comprehend that they were inadvertently participating in a mystery far older than their regime. Even bound in a cold cell, isolated from his parishioners and stripped of his vestments, the priest's internal sacrifice remained unbroken. His physical inability to consecrate the Eucharist on a stone altar forced his own life to become the offering. For the villagers, this realization was a devastating but necessary application of the gospel. They understood that the cross was not just a gilded ornament hanging above the tabernacle. It was a brutal, lived reality that was currently demanding everything from the man they loved. This historical tragedy speaks directly to a universal human vulnerability. We so often anchor our faith to the visible, tangible comforts of routine, relying on the presence of inspiring leaders and the peaceful predictability of our traditions. When those comforts are suddenly eradicated by tragedy, illness, or persecution, we are left standing before a terrifying void. The people of this forgotten village were forced into a radical purification of their intentions. They had to ask themselves the most difficult question a believer can face. Were they merely attached to the consolations of their faith, or were they truly committed to the God who sometimes permits the absolute stripping away of those consolations? Without their spiritual father to guide them, the responsibility of maintaining the light of faith fell heavily upon the shoulders of ordinary men and women. Consequently, the dynamic of their devotion shifted dramatically. The grand, communal liturgies were replaced by a quiet, invincible resilience that took root in the shadows. Mothers taught their children the catechism behind bolted doors. Fathers led the rosary in the fields, their calloused hands gripping the beads as if they were a lifeline. The violent suppression of the public church inadvertently breathed life into the domestic church, transforming every modest kitchen table into an altar of silent defiance. The authorities had locked the doors of the parish, but they had unknowingly unleashed a faith that could no longer be contained by stone walls. The profound human grief of losing their pastor was alchemized into a formidable spiritual weapon. They stopped waiting helplessly for a miraculous rescue and began to actively live the martyrdom alongside him, bearing the weight of his absence with heroic dignity. The story of this vanished priest reveals the inevitable failure of earthly powers that attempt to crush the human spirit. History is filled with empires that thought they could extinguish the church by striking down its shepherds. Yet, when tyranny attempts to smother the flame, it only scatters the embers, igniting a fire in faithful hearts that no secret police can extinguish. The empty altar stood as a permanent, silent judge against the regime. However, to truly comprehend the courage it took to stand at that altar in the first place, and to uncover the precise chain of events that led to that terrifying night, we must look back. We must examine the growing shadows that preceded his disappearance. To comprehend that silent Sunday morning, we must return to the months preceding his disappearance. The village had always been a quiet place, tucked away from the sprawling political ambitions of the capital. But the regime's shadow was lengthening, creeping steadily into the countryside. It began with subtle changes. Government officials started appearing in the back pews during Mass, not to pray, but to listen, taking meticulous notes on every word spoken from the pulpit. The parishioners noticed the strange, dark vehicles idling near the rectory at odd hours. The priest, a man who had dedicated his life to the simple rhythms of rural parish life, suddenly found himself the focal point of a dangerous ideological war. He knew he was being watched. The state demanded absolute allegiance, but the altar demanded a higher loyalty. This was the fundamental collision course. The villagers watched as their pastor aged visibly, carrying the invisible weight of impending doom, yet his voice only grew more resolute when he read the gospel. The harassment began psychologically. Small, unsettling events started to plague the parish. The church doors were found vandalized with state slogans. Letters from the bishop arrived opened and inspected. Then came the interviews. Local authorities would summon the priest for hours of questioning about his sermons, demanding names of parishioners who attended confession frequently, framing them as potential dissidents. The priest refused to break the seal of confession or hand over his flock to the wolves. This refusal marked a turning point. It was no longer just a matter of intimidation. It became a matter of elimination. The secret police realized that as long as the shepherd stood at the altar, the village would never fully submit to their atheistic vision. The decision to remove him was not made locally. Documents later revealed it was a calculated order from the highest levels of the Ministry of Interior. The night it finally happened was chillingly ordinary. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, and a bitter cold had settled over the village. The church was locked, the streets were empty, and the only light came from the small window of the rectory, where the priest was preparing his homily for the upcoming feast day. According to sparse testimonies, 3 unmarked cars pulled into the narrow street just past midnight. They did not use sirens. They did not knock politely. They broke the heavy rectory door with practiced efficiency. The housekeeper, a frail woman who lived in the adjacent annex, later whispered to the villagers that she heard the sound of heavy boots, a brief struggle, and a single stern voice ordering the priest to pack a small bag. She did not dare look out her window, paralyzed by the terrifying realization of what was unfolding. Within 20 minutes, the cars were gone, leaving behind an open door swinging in the freezing wind. When morning broke, the magnitude of the event hit the village like a physical blow. The housekeeper found the rectory ransacked. Books were scattered, religious items smashed, and his breviary left open on the desk. But the church presented the most jarring image. They had dragged him through the sanctuary as a final psychological mockery. A candlestick was knocked over, and a faint trail of mud led to the altar, stopping abruptly. This physical evidence of violence within the sacred space sparked a profound mystery. Where had they taken him? What were the charges? The villagers were left with a terrifying puzzle, and absolutely no authorities to turn to for help. To ask questions was to invite the same fate. The regime's tactic was complete erasure. They didn't just arrest him, they attempted to obliterate his existence. When parishioners approached the police, officers feigned complete ignorance, suggesting the priest had simply fled. This blatant lie added psychological cruelty. They wanted the village to believe their spiritual father had forsaken them. But the muddy footprints near the altar and the smashed rectory told the undeniable truth. The mystery deepened as months turned into years without any official confirmation of his death. He had been swallowed by state terror. Yet, this absence of information did not destroy their memory. It fueled a desperate need to uncover the truth, leading to a hidden investigation that would eventually expose the regime's vast war against the cross. The decades following the priest's sudden disappearance were defined by suffocating silence, but history proves no earthly regime can suppress the truth forever. When the totalitarian state finally collapsed, the heavy iron doors of the secret police archives were thrown open. Investigators found chilling, meticulously documented evidence of a massive, systematic war waged against the Catholic Church. Among classified dossiers, the villagers finally discovered the heroic truth about the man violently torn from their altar. His name was neatly typed on a yellowed index card, reduced to a prisoner number within a vast bureaucratic machine designed to completely eradicate the Christian faith. The classified files revealed a terrifyingly organized effort to dismantle the church from the inside out. The official charges against the beloved pastor were laid out in cold, clinical language. He was not arrested for any actual crime, but for the vague accusation of spreading anti-state propaganda. Interrogation transcripts showed his true offense was an absolute refusal to betray the seal of confession or inform on families who secretly baptized their children. The documents detailed the intense psychological pressure applied during his initial interrogations. Authorities offered him personal safety if he would publicly renounce his allegiance to Rome and embrace the state-sponsored church. His signature on the final page of the transcript, shaky but resolute, accompanied a single sentence refusing their demands, sealing his fate as an enemy of the state. The paper trail led researchers directly to one of the most brutal political prisons established by the regime, a place designed specifically to break the minds and spirits of religious dissidents. It was here that the true depth of the historical persecution came to light. The priest was placed in solitary confinement, subjected to freezing temperatures, and systematically starved. Yet, the historical evidence gathered from the testimonies of surviving cellmates paints a picture of incredible spiritual resistance. The state had stripped him of his vestments, his chalice, and his parish, but they could not strip him of his priesthood. Survivors recounted how the imprisoned clergy managed to celebrate clandestine masses in the darkness of their cells. They used smuggled crumbs of bread and wine made from fermented raisins, passing the Eucharist secretly from cell to nourish the starving faithful. The empty altar in the village had not been abandoned. The sacrifice of the Mass had simply been relocated to the cold concrete floor of a high-security prison. According to the final, heavily redacted medical report found in his dossier, the priest succumbed to exposure and malnutrition 3 years after his abduction. There was no public trial, no dignified funeral, and no marked grave. His captors buried him in an anonymous trench under the cover of night, confident that his memory would rot away in the frozen earth. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Catholic faith. By attempting to completely erase his life, they inadvertently elevated him to the ranks of the martyrs. The chilling historical evidence of his suffering did not bring despair to the village when it was finally revealed. Instead, it brought a profound, tearful vindication. They finally knew that their spiritual father had remained entirely faithful to them, bearing their names in his heart until his dying breath. Today, the oppressive regime that sought to replace God with the state is nothing more than a dark, cautionary chapter in the history books. Its statues have been torn down, and its leaders are largely forgotten. Meanwhile, the village church still stands, its bells still ring across the valley, and a new priest stands at the very altar that was once left devastatingly empty. The story of the vanished priest is a powerful historical testament to the enduring promise of Christ, that the gates of hell, no matter how heavily armed or bureaucratically organized, shall not prevail against his church. The blood of the martyrs remains the seed of faith, proving that true spiritual authority can never be silenced by force. If this profound story of hidden heroism and unyielding faith made you think, please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy discovering the lesser-known historical stories, profound mysteries, and enduring lessons of Catholic history, subscribe to the channel. There are many more incredible stories still waiting to be uncovered.